Good afternoon. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I'm grateful to the organizers for this opportunity to present. This presentation is derived from my doctoral research, which examined the social and historical context in which knowledge was produced regarding the Orcadian Neolithic. I'm indebted to the individuals who responded to emails, questionnaires, and/or subjected themselves to phone interviews during my doctoral research, including Caroline Wickham Jones, David Fraser, Nick Card, Neil Sharples, Beverly Ballin-Smith, Alexandra Shepard, Anna Ritchie, John Hunter, Hazel Moore, Ian Hodder, John Barrett, David Breeze, and Ian Ralston. Without the stories they shared with me, none of this research would have been possible. For this paper, how I have thought about Orkney has been strongly influenced by Gordon Barclay's papers from 2000 and 2001. His research amply showed how the prominence of Orkney biased archaeological interpretations, as well as demonstrating the danger of treating the exceptional as typical, as an issue identified by Harding in 1989. The Orcadian Neolithic is exceptional in every way. Instead of regurgitating or expanding these arguments, I'm going to focus on the role of the local community in bringing Orkney's Neolithic past to prominence rather than focusing on the biases that emerge from that prominence. Rather than presenting my narrative chronologically or thematically, I'm going to do something that may or may not work. I'm going to start in the middle with what I think is a defining moment for the archaeology of the Orcadian Neolithic, the Ancient Monuments and Protection Act of 1882. Then I will provide some context of how we got there before discussing the effect it had on studies of the Orcadian Neolithic. This is a defining moment for several reasons, but foremost, it was the first time that a higher value was placed on some sites and monuments over others in a codified way. This underlying mindset that some sites are more significant than others is really important to archaeology in general and to archaeology in the United Kingdom more specifically. It is worth noting that the two Neolithic landscapes designated World Heritage Sites within the United Kingdom were on the initial list of scheduled monuments. Both, but there are also several other Neolithic monument complexes where comparatively little research has been conducted that were also on that initial list. It is also a defining moment because the primary proponent of the act was Sir John Lubbock, who coined and defined the terms Paleolithic and Neolithic in 1865 in his book Prehistoric Times. The schedule or list of monuments for Scotland was prepared by the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland and published in 1880. The schedule seen here included the Ring of Brodgar and other stone pillars at Stennis in Orkney and the neighbouring pillars, as well as the chambered mound of Maes Howe. The Society of Antiquaries of Scotland was founded in December 1780, and the Reverend George Low was one of the first corresponding members, elected 6 months after the founding in July 1781. Low was likely the first and only Orcadian member of the Society until sometime after 1830. Low made two tours of Orkney in 1774 and again in 1778. These were essentially research trips to make observations on the natural history of the islands. In them, he included some of the antiquities which he observed during his travels. At the time of his death in 1795, Low's manuscripts remained unpublished. When Joseph Anderson published one of the tours in 1879, he included some of Low's extensive correspondence with members of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, including founding member George Patton and honorary member Thomas Pennant. Despite not being published, his work was relatively well known. Richard Gough's 1789 revised translation of Camden's Britannia incorporates an account that could only have been provided by George Low. The popularity of Camden's work was used to disseminate new knowledge as it was produced through successive editions of his prominent text on the history of Britain. As such, it raised awareness of Orcadian antiquities, sites, and monuments. Apparently, the Reverend George Barry acquired Low's manuscripts, which he then published, without acknowledging Low, in his 1805 publication, The History of the Orkney Islands. Many of the ideas that Barry expressed, and whether they were Low's or his is difficult to discern, including those he dismissed, were reinterpreted and recirculated by later archaeologists, including more recently by individuals such as Colin Renfrew, David Fraser, and Tim Phillips. I've highlighted the parts of these quotes which stand out or are particularly insightful. I'm sure we can all think of some convenient words and theories that snowball. I also highlighted a quote from Joseph Anderson, who essentially likened chambered cairns to honorable mansions for the dead. I think that should sound like a familiar interpretation to many of you. Daniel Wilson's association with the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland was brief, but significant. He introduced the concept of prehistory and brought the three-age system to Scotland. He was crucial to the negotiations that conveyed the collections of the Society to the Scottish Government, forming the basis of the National Museum of Scotland, and he is credited with establishing the regular publication of the Proceedings of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. In the preface to The Archaeology and Prehistoric Annals of Scotland, Wilson acknowledges the information generously provided by the Society Fellows, including Professor Peter Andreas Munch, George Petrie, and Lieutenant F.W.L. Thomas. Munch visited Orkney with a letter of introduction to a local sheriff clerk and antiquarian, George Petrie, that he had obtained from Wilson during a visit to Edinburgh in 1849. Lieutenant Thomas, who was stationed in Orkney, provided Wilson with detailed measurements and descriptions of the monuments situated around the Brodgar Peninsula, while Petrie provided him with details on several Orcadian sites and monuments, including the recently uncovered dwellings at Skara Brae. Joseph Anderson left an enduring imprint on Scottish archaeology as well as on the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. Anderson was the editor of the Society's proceedings and the keeper of the National Museum of Antiquities from 1869 to 1913. Prior to his role as editor and keeper, Anderson was the editor of the John O'Groats Journal in Wick, Caithness, on mainland Scotland close to Orkney. While based in Wick, Anderson worked with Orcadian George Petrie, who assisted in the production of careful ground plans and architectural drawings for investigations at the Broch of Yarrows in 1867 and the Cairn of Yarrows in 1869. Between 1849 and 1870, at least 25 recorded archaeological investigations were undertaken at putative Neolithic sites, with at least some supervision by a collection of fellows from the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, including F.W.L. Thomas, George Petrie, James Fair, Robert Hebden, Sir Henry Dryden, and William Trail. Most of the recorded excavations were published in the Proceedings of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. Although not all of the fellows working in Orkney between 1849 and 1870 were local residents, it is clear that local George Petrie was instrumental in organizing and recording many of the investigations, as is evident in a letter Petrie wrote to Daniel Wilson, where he lamented the disappearance of perhaps hundreds of archaeological sites without any record of their contents or constructions. Henry Dryden's beautiful technical drawings of the stone circles and Maze How, shown here, likely contributed to their inclusion on the schedule of monuments in 1880. From 1879 to 1880, the Ordnance Survey undertook a detailed mapping of the known Orcadian antiquities as part of their survey for the large-scale plans of Great Britain. In Scotland, the imperative to record antiquities was connected with a request made to the War Department by the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland through their president in 1855. At the time, the Society had recently been made aware, and I quote, that many of the primitive monuments of our national history, partly from the progress of agricultural improvements and in part from neglect and spoliation, were in the course of being removed. Remember back to Petrie's letter to Wilson? It is unclear if Petrie was the only one who wrote the Society with concerns, but he certainly contributed. The OS agreed to comply with the wishes of the Society to record historical monuments, but requested that the Society endeavor to assist the surveyors with local information through the cooperation of the resident gentry, ministers, schoolmasters, and others. In Orkney, the OS surveyors recorded 125 putative Neolithic sites, nearly half of the possible Neolithic sites known today. A reduction of inquiries into the Orcadian Neolithic seems to coincide with the passing of George Petrie in 1875, Robert James Hebden in 1877, and James Farrer in 1879. The efforts of the Fellows of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland in Orkney likely contributed to the inclusion of Orcadian monuments on the list provided by the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland when the Ancient Monuments and Protection Act was passed in 1882. Despite its shortfalls, the Ancient Monuments and Protection Act of 1882 established two important elements of historic preservation as it is practiced in the United Kingdom: a schedule, or list, of monuments requiring preservation, and an inspectorate of ancient monuments responsible for their acquisition and preservation. The inspectorate reported to the Commissioners of the Works and Public Buildings Department within the Office of Works at the time. Although it has been through many name changes, the inspectorate survives within Historic Environment Scotland today. Knowing the various names is essential when tracing its influence through time. The Inspector of Ancient Monuments, Charles Reed Pearce, appointed James Smith Richardson as an Inspector of Ancient Monuments in the Office of Works Edinburgh branch in 1910. Richardson was a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. During the years between World War I and World War II, 11 Orcadian Neolithic sites were taken into guardianship through the Office of Works. bringing the total number of Orcadian Neolithic sites under guardianship to 16. This represents more than 40% of all sites from all periods in Orkney under guardianship today. Toward the end of the 19th century, the necessity of a complete archaeological survey was recognized in order to adequately preserve and protect the ancient monuments of Britain. The Royal Commission on Ancient and Historical Monuments Scotland, RCA-HMS, was established in 1908 in response to the need for an inventory of significant ancient monuments to be compiled in order to better implement the legal protections provided by the Ancient Monuments and Protections Act, along with subsequent legislation. Surveys were begun in Orkney and Shetland in 1928. The report concluded that the general condition of the monuments is unsatisfactory, and those which are not under the protection of Your Majesty's Office of Works are deteriorating rapidly. However, the report further noted positive progress being made by the Orkney Antiquarian Society in increasing the interest taken in and the respect felt for their heritage by the people of the islands. Although a major storm had exposed Skara Brae in 1850, little had been done to protect and preserve the site from the encroachment of the sea. Another storm in December 1924 severely damaged House 3. Consequently, the Office of Works placed the site under guardianship and spent the summers of 1925 and 1926 constructing a seawall from stone quarried on the site and filled with material excavated from the site. Yes, stone and material from the site make up the seawall today. In 1927, the Office of Works began clearing the interior of the structures at the site in preparation for stabilization and preservation. The scale of the conservation activities, along with the lack of archaeological supervision, raised concerns with local members of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. The Society then suggested that the newly appointed Abercrombie Chair of Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh, Vergorn Child, observe the clearance and stabilization work at Skara Brae. In response, the Office of Works quickly appointed Child to oversee the archaeological activities at the site, rather than the preservation activities. In 1929, James Richardson not only visited Skara Brae during the work there, but also visited the island of Rousey, where he met with Walter Grant, the major landowner on the island and the director of the Highland Distillers Company Limited. During the visit to Grant's excavations at Westside, Richardson suggested that Grant should undertake excavations at the Broch of Midhow, and Grant began excavations there in 1930. Grant enlisted the help of John Graham Callender, the keeper of the National Museum of Antiquities Scotland, and the editor of the Proceedings of the Society of Antiquaries Scotland. Callender went on to collaborate with Grant on the excavation and publication of 6 Orcadian sites, including several Neolithic chambered cairns. Grant's contribution to Orcadian archaeology goes beyond his enthusiasm and financial support for the excavations on Rousey, but also includes his dedication to conservation, as he placed many of the sites he excavated under guardianship with the Office of Works. It seems that the connections made through the visit by James Richardson, Inspector of Ancient Monuments and member of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, in 1929 had a lasting impact. The underlying motivation for the Skara Brae excavations in 1972 to 1973 was to contextualize the assemblage from Child's excavations in preparation for a new exhibit at the National Museum of Antiquities Scotland. At the time, the keeper of the museum was Robert Stevenson, a former student of Child. The excavations were led by David V. Clark, then a research assistant at the museum, and Anna Ritchie, then on temporary lectureship with the University of Edinburgh. The excavations were undertaken with permission and major support from the Department of Environment Ancient Monuments Division, a new incarnation of the Ministry of Works, who provided the substantial financial backing and on-site support necessary for the project. An influential social network was forged, maintained, and interwoven through a series of excavations undertaken during the 1970s and 1980s that didn't actually start with Skara Brae. Graham and Anna Ritchie's first excavation in Orkney in 1967 was of a cairn in the back garden of some friends of Graham's parents. This excavation was based on familial and personal relationships with local residents, even though Graham was working for the RCA HMS at the time. Shortly thereafter, in 1970, the DOE asked Anna Ritchie to oversee excavations at Buckaway. A number of people from Buckaway would follow Anna to work on the excavations at Skara Brae and continue to work with her at Nap of Howard and with her husband Graham at the Stones of Stennis. Some of those workers returned to Skara Brae with Clark in 1977 and continued with him for the excavations at the Links of Notland. Members of these excavations then went on to work at Pirawall and the Point of Cot. Finally, Anna Ritchie returned to excavate home of Papa Westray North. This network essentially spawned most of the future archaeological inquiries into the Orcadian Neolithic. It also had a lot of influence and control over the production of knowledge regarding the Orcadian Neolithic. There is, therefore, potential here for bias through self-reinforcing ideas within a coherent group. In some ways, it even spawned Colin Richards, who initially came to the National Museum of Antiquities Scotland to study the ceramics from Links of Noltland with David Clark. His PhD research changed, and he discovered Barn House and went on to direct the Queen Wydford project. Colin Renfrew came to Orkney to obtain radiocarbon dates because the questions raised by radiocarbon chronologies had led him to research the processes of social change and social structures during the Neolithic as an alternative to explanatory models based on diffusion. According to Renfrew, both Wessex and the Orkneys were good areas to look at those things because of the phenomenal preservation of the monuments. However, Renfrew's overarching aim for the project was to investigate not simply the monuments' origin and chronology, but their place and function in the social life of the societies which created them. During the excavations, Renfrew was assisted by some notable individuals, including Dr. Donald Davidson, Dr. Richard Jones, Daphne Home Lorimer, John Cherry, and John W. Hedges. The interactions his team had with local resident Ronald Simison had a lasting impact. Simison had first uncovered a large number of human remains at the chambered cairn of Ibister in 1958. Simison's initial excavations were backfilled by an inspector of ancient monuments to ensure no further unauthorized excavations took place. Renfrew and his team visited the site in 1972. During the visit, Simison took him to see the burnt mound at Little Farm. John Hedges, pictured bottom left on top of one of the stones at the Ring of Brodgar, undertook excavations at Little Farm from 1973 to 1975. Hedges was subsequently retained by the Orkney Heritage Society to undertake further investigations in Orkney. Hedges' experiences led him to move to Orkney permanently and found North of Scotland Archaeological Services, NOSAS, in June 1977. NOSAS was the first archaeological unit in Scotland outside of Edinburgh and would be involved in further investigations at Ibister, the Standing Stone Socket at Deepdale, and the multi-component site at Howe of Howe. The Orkney Heritage Society was established in 1967. In collaboration with the RCA HMS and the Scottish Development Department Ancient Monuments Division, the Orkney Heritage Society appointed Raymond Lamb the first Orkney Archaeological Officer in 1978. In 1988, an effort was made to nominate Maze Howe, the Stones of Stennis, and the Ring of Brodgar for World Heritage status. The initial nomination proposal failed because it didn't have the full support of the Orkney archaeologist, Raymond Lamb, due to the fact that the proposal didn't include more sites, specifically Skara Brae. Following a lot of work conducted by Colin Richards, in 1996 the Orkney Heritage Society determined that the arrangement, which had established the Orkney SMR, was insufficient to meet Orkney's needs and appointed Julie Gibson to replace Raymond Lamb. At the time, the Orkney Heritage Society was helmed by Daphne Home Lorimer. Lorimer had worked with Colin Renfrew at Quaterniss in 1973 and retired to Orkney after her career as a radiographer in London. Lorimer was the guiding force behind the establishment of the Orkney Archaeological Trust, which eventually led to the establishment of the Orkney Research Centre for Archaeology and the Orkney Archaeology Society. Lorimer was also a signatory of the Declaration of Intent that led to the inscription of the Heart of Neolithic Orkney World Heritage Site, whose nomination was overseen by David Breeze and Patrick Ashmore with Historic Scotland. Since the inscription of the World Heritage Site in 1999, very little archaeological research has been undertaken in Orkney without some consideration of the relationship of the intervention to the management of the World Heritage Site. The creation of the World Heritage Site acted as a catalyst for the development of an institutional infrastructure to support a wide range of archaeological investigations, which is demonstrated through the growth and activities associated with both the Orkney College University of Highlands and Islands Archaeology Institute and the Orkney Research Centre for Archaeology. The World Heritage Site also stimulated an agglomeration of individuals and institutions that engage with the Orcadian material past. According to Nick Card, in 1998, there were only 3 archaeologists in Orkney, but by 2017, there were around 30 archaeologists residing there. Important to the recent growth has been major community archaeology projects across the islands. Throughout this narrative, I have emphasized the power and impact local residents are able to exert through access and a voice in major institutions like the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, Historic Environment Scotland, or the National Museum. In addition, non local archaeologists who have worked in Orkney tend to fall in love with it, from James Fair to Vergorn Child to the Richies to Nick Card, Colin Richards, Caroline Wickham Jones, Jane Downs, and many others throughout the history of investigation. The Siren Song of the North has called them to Orkney and its exceptional Neolithic archaeology.